in all this area, especially our blackheads. Blackheads, previously we have got in at Kottayam, we had a good collection, good roosting here 30 years back. But now it has all gone. I think they were roosting in one or two coconut trees near our market. But now that coconut trees have gone and the blackheads have also disappeared. So then we used to see the annual movement of these blackheads connected with our rains. So blackheads. Then after some time, as we do our emerald bird count, we used to see them, or they start coming back to our place, not in that previous number. The first incident where I saw a blackhead very closely was an injured, a blackhead was shot. One evening, one blackhead was shot and it was lying in the roadside. So I went near him and I saw that it has gone through his shoulder and come out, I think. And after some time, it has expired. That is my thing with the blackhead. Nowadays, I am not at all seeing them in our market. And I invite Mr. Nishant Kumar to continue his oration. Okay. Nishant Kumar, please.
Thank you, sir. So I'll first share the screen so that so is the presentation visible to people? Am I audible?
Yes, you are audible.
And the presentation is visible, right?
Yes, that screen you have shared.
Sure. So you can see the first screen of the presentation, right? It's already on display. Okay, wait.
Can you see Hariva?
I think there's some glitch. Okay. Okay. I will do that.
Okay. Yes. Now we can see.
Is it visible? Okay. Correct? Perfect. Sorry for the initial glitch, people. Hello, everyone. A warm good evening from Delhi. And thanks a lot to organizers from Kottayam National Society that we have some opportunity to meet over this webinar and discuss few things regarding the aspects of animal lives with which we share our living spaces. So if we go into the history when humans were the hunter-gatherers, And like how Sri Kumar sir just shared his perspectives about kite numbers, with this screen on display, you can relate with the idea of numbers, which were quite important to human beings. Human beings are one of the few species that can consciously keep account. We also know about primates and corvids, which can count up till a certain level. But of course, human beings outsmart these animals by leaps and bounds. I'm stressing on the idea of numbers because human beings have a very unique flair to identify discontinuities. So on the screen, which depicts one of the cave paintings, is on your screen to share the perspective of why humans tend to discriminate things in nature in context of discontinuities. So one aspect of identifying discontinuities is this species is different from another species or entities which human beings get to see in and around their spaces. And another aspect of identifying discontinuity is when you have similarly looking individuals distributed in a space, you start to give them a count. So, because we are all nature enthusiasts in one or the multiple ways, we all understand what biodiversity is and what species are. So, the number species depicts biodiversity, and the number of individuals within those species constitute multiple populations in a given area at a given time. So, we take a lot of pride when we discuss about the importance of nature these days, and we discuss about the kind of precarity humanity has leveraged at the cost. Humanity has kind of impacted on the non-human systems. So it will be important for us to discuss the aspect of research by Ernst Mayr, who is also known as Charles Darwin of 21st century, that when he went to Papua New Guinea in 1950s to do his PhD research, he identified 126 different species of birds of paradise. Birds of paradise are specifically characterized by their long tails, the tail feathers. And to his astonishment, those people on Papua New Guinea islands, the tribes which were inhabiting those systems, already had 125 names. So, in one way, Ernst Mayr could only resolve the difference in between two species, and that gives the kind of hallmark in context of how well human beings have followed the non-human system around them. Of course, when we were hunter-gatherers and then when we became agriculturists, this transition allowed us to appreciate multiple modalities under which we could harness the power of nature around us and could sustain a certain number of human beings in a given area. So in context of present times, when we are facing a lot of troubles, these ancient depictions by Warli, Suara, and Gond tribes within our part of the world depicts these relationships. So some of these drawings depict the continuity of life forms. The other drawings depict the tree of life. The third one depicts the connection in between different aspects of nature. And all this while we can appreciate the concept of numbers. Down here, you can also see and appreciate the idea of relationship with animals that modern humans could establish, starting from dogs. So the first animal to be domesticated in our system or by humans, modern humans, was dog. And then we have repeated the same history with so many different animals. So currently, we have modern ways to interpret the relationships among multiple species, which are depicted in the artwork on our screen. And one would agree with me that in the sense of what these tribes have depicted through their artwork does not look very ancient and primitive. So I guess we have just increased the sophistication we identify in context of specific relationships. But what is troubling is the impact of modern humans, which occupies cities and urban spaces. On our screen currently, we have a snapshot of one of the largest landfills in Asia, situated on the eastern border of Delhi. It's called Gazipur, and at a time it houses about 10,000 black-eared kites. So, in context of the numbers which Sri Kumar sir was just discussing, we need to take some perspective about these numbers of kites on the landfills or wherever in our part of the world you get to see about 100, 200 or more kites communally roosting at a space. More often than not, it is very likely that these kites belong to the migratory race which comes from Central Asia. A vital aspect to mention in context of our journey from the first slide to the second slide and towards our urban settlement is the social ecological relationships with multiple animals around us. At times they are domesticated, like the kind of offerings we give to our cattle, and at times they are wild animals, much like what you see on the other aspects right side of the screen. And these relationships, socio-economic, ecological relationships, have not come in one day. And in many parts of the world, including South Asia, these relationships are so ingrained in our religious expressions that we all know of many rituals which are practiced by people from multiple cultures. So, in South Asia, irrespective of the cultural and religious divide, we understand and we all have seen, or probably many of us are also practicing these rituals of offering food to animals. In one or the other way, we have retained the relationships in context of expressions or responsibility towards animals. But one part of the talk would also discuss it in context of the impacts such kind of feeding or misplaced compassion might have when our nation is starving. So we all know that 15% of India goes hungry to their beds every night. And this is a cause of concern because we have a certain undesirable legacies associated with human domination in urban systems. Currently, on the screen, which is visible to you, we can appreciate the distribution of black kites throughout the old world. The color scheme on this map depicts the residential and migratory races of these black kites. So all the areas under the color orange represent the populations which come down when winters hit in this part of the world, and the colors depicted and the regions depicted in yellow are of residential species, subspecies of black kites. Our talk today would take inferences, would take examples from a research we have been doing in Delhi for the last 8 years and in the nearby region. So I just talked about the movement of birds from the polar areas or from the temperate regions towards the tropical systems, and multiple populations of these birds start from their native ranges. In this context, we have depicted the bird systems which we have identified in Delhi, and we have found them to be linked with Mongolia. Isn't this fascinating for us to appreciate the idea that in mere 300 years, these birds, which take birth into their native systems and which are pretty much like the older times. So the region which you can identify and relate with Mongolia, Kazakhstan, southern parts of Russia, and northern Xinjiang are covered by steppes. These are grasslands, and the way people live in these systems has not changed for thousands of years. You can still go there and witness how agriculturists and herders have been living in these systems for hundreds and thousands of years. Interestingly, once these birds cross Himalayas, somewhere around Karakoram range in Jammu and Kashmir, they get to witness a change in the landscape, which is visible in the form of human signatures. So birds start with their innate drivers of what pushes them to migrate, and then they meet altogether a new system. And this will give you certain clue towards the later part of presentation of why you don't see a similar number of kites in context of what you used to witness in your childhood. And this is specifically valuable for our friends who are senior to us and who have witnessed these changes, and probably they had a lot of time to appreciate these changes. Unfortunately, while we can appreciate the idea of connectivity we have or virtual connectivity we have in the modern age, somewhere our relationships with our backyards has been altered severely. We don't find modern generations appreciating the hallmark of biodiversity and the nuances of nature which are interplaying all around us. And this is where today's talk would be focused, which would depict the idea of science behind animal numbers. I'm very sure that for the past 2 months, you all have been listening to experts, very senior experts, who are discussing the concept of change in numbers of animals. And of course, these changes are either attributed to the conservation status of these animals or management of these species. If you have animal numbers which actually become problem to you. For instance, if we have friends who are listening to us from the fringes of national parks or from the fringes of areas where you do find wild animals, we face a lot of atrocities from crop depredation or human animal conflicts. So using what small we have learned through our research efforts in Delhi, I would try and hope to connect with all these different dimensions of human animal relationships. And if there are points which I'm not able to cover, I'm very happy to entertain questions, not necessarily dependent on kite research, but anything in context of human animal relationships and in context of how we can foresee the nuances of conservation in future. So when we talk about kites, we understand the idea that of course, it's a majestic species. It's very hard for somebody who has a slightless interest in birds and other animal species. And of course, they would not miss the grace with which these birds fly within the human dominated systems. A common question our research group gets to address is the motivation behind conducting this research when we all have been trained as wildlife biologists. And it quickly translates the idea of training somebody for wildlife biology is to expect them serving into the wilderness areas. But somewhere, modern challenges in context of a nation which houses 1.3 billion people and is also one of the major countries or mega biodiverse regions of the world, you have to appreciate the fact that the line in between where we have human dominated systems and where we have our protected areas are getting blurred with each passing decade. So we all understand a major impact we created on human systems when we lost populations of vultures from multiple parts of the world, including South Asia. So by the turn of this century, we almost lost about 98% of these birds. And our team thought it to be important that one needs to address the potential change in the number of other members of avian scavengers once you see a downfall in the number of vultures. So, in that context, this research was conceptualized in December 2012, and we had a set of sampling plots. You can see those plots on the screen, and these plots were distributed on the gradients of urbanization. These urban gradients allow us to understand how resource is being perceived by a species which does not have a humanistic criteria of urban settlement, and why it is important for us to appreciate the whole range under which urban response from kite allows them to have a very successful life in human dominated systems, even when we have suffered a recent decline in the vulture numbers. So currently, the number of sampling points has increased to 30, and this allows us to appreciate the nuances of urban settlement of these birds into the 1500 square kilometer area of National Capital Region. Of course, once we were trying to understand the situation or the urban ecology of kites, it was important for us to witness how well are kites doing. So it is not much of a surprise to anyone that in order to understand health of a population, one needs to first target the situation of the breeding units. If you have well-performing breeding units, and if you have well-performing breeding units that release viable fledglings or viable offsprings into the system, you can be very sure about the kind of resources which are available to support them. Of course, if you have been bird watchers, and I guess Fertile Natural Society is somehow associated with a lot of bird watchers, and when you are a bird watcher, it is very rare for you to see raptors. And even if you see raptors and multiple species, it is very infrequent for you to identify the kind of numbers which one can appreciate for black kites. So, what becomes a roadblock for other researchers who work on raptors is really an opportunity for us. And we are very thankful for the kind of organic development which happened in the form of researchers and field assistants we have had for these last 7, 8 years to conduct this monitoring of nests every week. You would appreciate the fact that we do this sampling of nests which are situated on an average about 12 meters from ground, which is a daunting task, in order to understand the movement of these birds, because we all understand that animals are different from plants in context of acquisition of resources by movement. Animals are not static units. So if you have an idea of where and why they are moving, you can potentially understand the nuances of their ecology. The science of ecology experimentally tries to understand why we have certain abundance at a place and why we have a very different kind of distribution for a species X as opposed to species Y. And in order to solve that riddle, we also place transmitters on back of substantial number of these birds through the last 8 years of our sampling. The very first result which came after the monitoring in the first season itself revealed to us that black kite breeding densities have not changed in the Delhi territorial area. So we were quite fortunate to have a comparable study which was published in the journal IBIS in 1971, and it estimated the breeding densities of kites in 150 square kilometer area at about 15 nests per square kilometer. 60 years after that sampling, we repeated the effort to a much larger area. So Vladimir Gulishin, who conducted the earlier study, only sampled 150 square kilometer. In our case, we did it for 1500 square kilometer of Delhi. And by and large, the densities did not change. So, of course, this allowed us to appreciate the fact that vultures and kites were not occupying the same territorial systems. They were not occupying same niches. And even if you could relate them in context of what probably they were doing as scavengers. Their duties as scavengers or their professional obligations, or what we call in ecology as niche, was definitely quite different from each other. Now we can appreciate that they are rather city scavengers and not obligate scavengers as we as vultures are. So this motivation to conduct research on black kites, or motivation to even appreciate black kites and their ecology, is not very different for the black kite research team. In 2012, when we formally started this study, we used to have conversations with people who were our colleagues and also people who were general citizens. And of course, everybody used to talk about the number of kites they used to witness on the landfill, which was situated on the eastern border of Delhi. And I guess I'm not very sure about the size of Kottayam city, but if it has a landfill site or a dumping ground, it would not take a big guess to imagine that people would be witnessing a lot of black kites hovering out there. So in this picture, you can see me discussing potential research ideas on the largest landfill in Delhi. And of course, it's not a COVID-19 pic. And it is rather discussing the landfill conundrum in context of anticipating what kind of resources would be available for kites in very human-dominated system. So Delhi currently now has about 20 to 25 million people, and each day we produce a lot of garbage. It was quite synonymous for us to relate kites with garbage, or relate any scavenger for that sort with garbage. Even before I could start this research for my master's dissertation, I had numerous comments from multiple people who would suggest me otherwise in context of researching black kites as a futile idea. In their eyes, whatever they probably observed once or twice in context of kite picking something odd from their native systems or from their backyards allowed them to club black kites under the category of obligate scavengers. Of course, the first paper which came out from this study and was published in the journal Bird Study appreciated that while 60% of the diet was constituted by scavenging, these birds did hunt on whole-bodied prey, and we regularly witnessed whole-bodied prey in the kite nets. Of course, it was very important for us to appreciate down the line that the resources which are available on the dump in context of about 40% of whatever reaches our landfills is open not only for multiple flocks and populations of black kites, but also other scavengers. In this system, you can see a dog and also a human scavenger. So we are currently facing lockdown because of a global pandemic, and this pandemic has originated because of similar associations which are primarily human driven. So human beings are immune to a lot of diseases because we are sort of victors in one sense of the genetic stock which allowed us to come from our ancestors. But currently, the world literally survives on the supply of antibiotics. We have a lot of health professionals, and they would appreciate the fact that if we do not have these drugs, antibiotics, and other medical support system, we cannot imagine about 8 billion of us surviving on this planet. And potentially, we are going to add 2 more billion people by 2050. So when human cultures or cultural practices or socio-economic indulgences of the sort in context of manual scavenging allows them to interact with multiple animals, we create situations where diseases can jump from animals to humans, and it is more frequent in context of evolutionary relationship. So it is very likely that diseases would jump from a mammal to mammal and not from a bird to a mammal. So Similarly, if there are other birds in the system, it is very likely that they might pick diseases from kites, and likewise. So towards end of this presentation, I would also lay stress on this phenomena in context of zoonotic diseases. This is another picture from a close range, and you can appreciate the pack of feral dogs on the landfill with multiple bird species and, of course, human scavengers, and a set of researchers who had this conundrum of landfills to solve. So initially, it was just to enumerate the number of these kites, and by now we understand that there are about 9,000 to 10,000 of these birds, and they eat about 200 grams of fill in one day. So we can appreciate the kind of ecosystem service they provide to us. Otherwise, that much amount of meat would be rotting in our streets, potentially leading to a lot of nuisance and diseases. On this screen, we can appreciate the kind of contentions we have in our modern urban systems in context of what are the human areas, what are the animal areas, and what are the waste areas. So from Neolithic age onwards, if we recall our lessons in history, we can appreciate the fact that humans beings started to settle down as societies. Once you form societies, it was important for us to relate with a constant supply of food and a predictable supply of food. And of course, that was also associated with agriculture. With these two advents, we also started creating waste. So archaeological sites from Neolithic age onwards allows us to understand the conundrum of waste. And on these wastes, we have recorded the fossils of animals, which potentially used to take opportunistic benefits. But in a city which houses about 25 million humans, we have a huge issue of where to put our filth. So the kite team in this picture is standing atop Gazipo landfill, which receives about 500 truckloads of garbage every day. Each of this truck carries about 5 ton of waste. And of course, there are two other landfills in the system. There are multiple ephemeral garbage units within the same city. And if we multiply this with the areas where human beings are occupying spaces on Earth, the conundrum of waste areas multiplies by so many times. Of course, humans in themselves are not very similar. So we have multiple stakeholders within the human populations. Many people live in high rise buildings, posh areas, and then you have people who live in middle class houses, which are depicted on this part of the screen. This landfill is also associated with informal settlements, and I'm discussing these connotations in context of how potentially we might be creating multiple situations like corona or similar diseases if we are not mindful. So there are multiple diseases which erupt in a system, and the way we interact with us amongst ourselves, the way we interact with animals, and the way animals take opportunistic benefits from anthropogenic resources creates potential cases. There might be n number of different diseases which erupt in a system, but which potentially do not get a chance. In context of how fast one can evolve, we all understand that macroscopic species like us take thousands and millions of years to evolve into a specific unit. But for microbes, it can happen in months, days, and years. And that is the conundrum humans are supposed to face. In this context, after we appreciated a constant breeding density of black kites in Delhi, we wanted to understand, or the bigger question to us was, why would a kite select a certain area? So even when the breeding densities were pretty constant from 1970s onwards, our sampling could reveal that these nesting densities used to vary from 0 nests per square kilometer in certain pockets to 180 nests per per square kilometer in other pockets. And of course, this whole range was in context of how well kites are settling into different city pockets. A city like Delhi, which is so heterogeneously developed, we all can understand that tropical cities do not have a well planned outlook for major sections of the city area. And while it allows us to support our local populations, it also leads to a lot of problems. So when you get to see a lot of kites in the area, you get to see a lot of trees around as well. But of course, not every tree in the city system houses a kite nest. So once you have these situations, you wonder why kites are nesting in a certain area and not in other areas. For bird watchers, it would not be tough for you to identify a kite nest. And we similarly did an analysis which was based on comparison of 150 nesting areas with 150 random areas. So idea was, if you compare nest areas with random areas, it will allow you to appreciate the fact what are the drivers which allow a kite to decide a nesting area. It would be pretty much similar to how students decide their residential areas in universities. So in each city we have university, and we have students coming from surrounding areas to settle into the city system, and of course they wish to gain a degree. So Kottayam or Delhi or any other city for that matter would have would not have a very uniform presence of resources which can support a student. So in that case, students would like to live in the area which is quite in proximity to the university, and probably which is also quite near to a dining hall and a library. Of course, students would also look to live in an area which is quite safe in one regard. And similarly, kites were not quite different. So we had about 35 different variables, which we thought would help us predict the distribution of kites into the city and why they happen to select habitats in a certain fashion. In that context, about 6 variables allowed us to discriminate the nesting areas with random areas where kite nests were not found. And the result of our study is pictorially depicted here in our screen, where we could identify that kites simultaneously used to identify food resource units, which would, of course, not known before, and places where they could build a nest so that if it is there in proximity of a food resource unit, a kite would readily go and pick the potential food item and get back to the nest to provision the chicks and the female. What was specifically different for this study, which was conducted from 2013 to 2016, was a ritual activity which people in northern India practice. I'm not aware if it happens in southern India as well, but people who follow Islamic faith in Delhi and older sections of Delhi, to be precise, offer meat chunks to kites to request relief. These meat chunks are picked by kites because they're quite agile on their wings, and we all can appreciate how well they can come down, swoop on a piece of meat, and take it away. So, in that context, the meat chunks which we could identify in the first year of our sampling actually belong to the ritual activity which were practiced at the mosques units. So, as part of this exercise where we wanted to understand the habitat selection criteria, we spatially allocated the resource units in terms of mosques which were distributed in the geography of Delhi. And of course, we tried to understand how the proximity of nest units in context of where these mosques units are distributed will help us to predict the success of a nest and how frequently a nest is occupied by a black kite year after year. So for those people who do not understand the details of kite ecology and raptor ecology in general, it would be great for them to learn that black kites are known to mate for life. We have not done research. We have not done this research in this part of the world, but black kites are known to pair for life, and they tend to occupy site year after year, which is ecological 2013 to 2016, to learn that kites not only get opportunities to take benefit from anthropogenic resources, they also face challenges. As depicted in the initial slides, you would not expect a single species to take advantage from human-dominated system. Of course, major discussions in context of human-animal relationships rather point fingers at the levels of destruction caused by humans on animal systems, and we have put many different species to the levels of precarity. These species are called critically endangered animals, but a handful of species like black kites, feral dogs, rhesus macaques, rats, and likewise take a lot of opportunity from human-dominated system. And once you have this concoction of different species trying to capitalize on anthropogenic resources, it was not surprising for us to identify that many of these species were potential predators on nests of black kites. So on the screen, we have images from the trail cameras, which were set to monitor these nests 24/7. And eggs were most likely predated by house crow and jungle crow. And of course, it was not surprising for us to understand the devastating impacts of rhesus macaques on many of the nests where we used to find regular events of predation. So, for people who understand nuances of ecology and evolution, you would understand that these two species are highly cognitive and and do have and diversity. You need to be really up on your toes because these species, because of the cognitive endowment they have, they can recall where resource units are present. So the whole discussion of the past 35 minutes can be summed up in the form of a daily treasure hunt, which a kite pair has to do in a city which is distributed in this fashion. So this image is from a nest which was situated on a telephone tower, and you can appreciate the kind of urban maze we have created into tropical city systems. Of the meat chunks which are tossed by people as a ritual offer, and the city life is quite tough in context of a male which needs to feed one female and two potential chicks which might come out of the eggs which are being incubated by this female. So while we are facing the conundrum of lockdown, you would appreciate the fact that female is locked down in the nest of a kite for about 60 days. And all this while, male majorly uptakes the role of provisioning. And it is interesting for us because when we sample these nests with our trail cameras, we can appreciate the fact that the male comes back within 5 minutes. So it takes a flight, purposely has identified resource units in context of mosque locations where meat tossing is being done. And these meat chunks are available for kites to capitalize upon. Of course, when you visualize a city like this, people would not be tossing meat in everywhere, in the areas everywhere. And of course, it is largely associated with the roads, which are again linked to the mosques. So roads were one of the major predictors of where a kite would like to nest. So crossroads are also areas or no man land areas where people tend to deposit a lot of garbage. And of course, roads are also places where people used to toss meat. So kites have to face a lot of competition in context of potential species, which might be present on that why a garbage pile which might be at the end of this road when it is kind of dominated by different species would not allow a bird like this to take access. Although every different species, which is probably taking benefit or which is has a carnivorous life history trait, would like to take advantage of meat chunks in this fashion, but we don't see eagles in our ecosystems. And quite often, people call kites as eagles in this part of India. I'm not sure about Kerala because, except for Delhi and NCR region, we have more popular local names for these birds. In the Indo-Gangetic belt, they're called cheel, and we have similar different names for these birds. And more often than not, this confusion in between eagle and kites would not be a thing for people who largely identify birds in the native dialects. A very recent effort which took data from 2013 till 2019 wanted to identify the population level impacts. As I was discussing, that if you have a breeding unit which is performing well in context of acquisition of resources, and if those breeding units are able to release successful fledglings from their nest, you would appreciate that the population structure is expected to be healthy in case these breeding units are performing healthy. So from 2013 till 2018, we did this sampling of nesting densities within the 30 plots, which I did show in the beginning of this presentation. And of course, we could quantify on the basis of plot length itself in context of how well the resource units are distributed in relation to the sampling plots. And like very much like our expectations in context of this human philanthropic activity regulating the kite densities, the human philanthropic activity was also found important for the population densities or nests per square kilometer within these plots. Another factor which was quite important was nesting substrate itself. So, as I said, that you might have a lot of trees around you and you might have a lot of kites around you, but you don't find kite nests everywhere, which generally essentiates the idea of selection of resource units. And in that context, not all trees and not all poles or towers are suitable for kites to build nests. And the densities of kites which we used to found, which we found in the plots which we sampled from 2013 till 2019 were dependent on the number of tree towers which we found were potentially capable of supporting a kite nest. So if you are a kite, you can imagine the kind of constraints you like to nest and which is safe enough. And then once you build a nest in that particular city system, you also need to take into account the idea of acquiring enough food from either from philanthropic activity or from the enormous garbage which is available around. So we can take this context into detail if it was required by certain participants of this webinar. And now with this screen, we have reached the concept which I was just discussing in context of the impacts of crows and other species which might be potentially predating nests of kites or taking away chicks and eggs from a kite nest. So because the whole relationship of humans and kites or multiple species within human dominated system is not a 5-10 year old phenomena. We wanted to understand why certain kite pairs were aggressive and they used to defend their nests by attacking the person who was going to inspect the nest and occasionally also the people who were part of the team. It was quite intriguing for us to understand the fact that kites did not attack other people in the parks or roadside areas. So if you boil this down to the context of a scientific analysis, we differentiate the defense criteria by scores. For this high levels of orders in text of 1, 2, and 3, wherein first being the case where kites would not show very vigorous defense activities. In the second case, it was largely associated with the hovering and alarm. And in the third case, hovering and alarm was also associating who were inspecting the nesting territories. So it is not surprising for us to imagine that from 1 towards 3, the cost to defend would be high. And of course, when we wanted to question the criteria of why a certain kite pair would invest in highest of the cost, we have to imagine about potential drivers. When you do science or when you do scientific study, or even when we learn about basics of science, we understand that we follow a hypothetical deductive method. And in that context, we did derive few hypotheses in context of habitat selection. So the gradient of urbanization, how much of green area is available within the kite territory, and where and how many roads are there. When these variables were associated with habitat selection, it was not surprising for us to find the importance of these variables, or to build hypothesis in context of kite attacks with these variables, because kites would not necessarily invest differently while choosing a habitat system in a city and while deciding when and how to attack to a potential nest robber. So human beings quite recently were potential predators to anything which used to fly, crawl, or move. And in that context, once this analysis was complete in context of 116 nests, which were sampled about 7 times during the breeding seasons of 2013 till 2018, we could understand that the nest content was very important. So the nests which were having higher number of eggs or chicks were the ones where we used to identify higher scores of defense. The nests which had chicks of higher nesting maturity stage, which means the parents could identify high value in their nest, were associated with high cost to defend. And of course, the aggression was also found to be associated with habitation criteria in context of how urbanized a plot system is, how many people are there in that area. And when you have a lot of people who are available for kites to habituate, so more often than not, a lot of species are not able to adjust to human presence. But animals like dogs, macaques, kites, crows, and likewise have different levels of adjustment with humans. Even within the same species, not every individual has a similar tolerance for humans. And understanding that, a vital aspect of this analysis focused on relating the very high cost of taking decisions to attack during the incubation period itself. So we all are quite familiar with fixed deposits, and we all are quite familiar with mutual funds, and we all are quite familiar with shares and debentures. So in all these economic investments, when we see a potential in an entity or different in that context, that we expected very experienced kites, or the kites which were most capable to take advantage of the anthropogenic system. And these kites were expected to defend their nests highly. And of course, this expectation was on the basis of them regularly releasing larger number of fledglings from their nest. So a relationship in context of the defense score predicting higher number of fledglings released at the end of the nesting was found. So this relationship allowed us to achieve 100% aggressive manner because they were capable pairs to swoop down and take that much risk to come and attack on a potential nest robber. So a kite which is attacking the people who were doing nest inspections were also are also likely to be the best of nest defenders in case they face a murder of crows or troop of monkeys which can potentially reach the same nest to remove eggs or chicks. So I'll refrain from going into more details, and I would welcome questions in this context for sure. And it was interesting for us to note the fact that when we have sampled hundreds of nests over the years, only a handful of people complain about the kite attack, and the larger notion available in the respondents who were interviewed in context of kites' aggressive behavior was kites performing the duty of a parent. So people used to say that kites are doing the duty of a parent, and when we are disturbing their systems, it is very usual for them and it is very natural for them to attack a potential intruder. And all these people who were residing in and around these kite colonies or kite nesting territories used to avoid these aggressive kite areas. So, in one way, this also showcases why India or Indian subcontinent as a region of the world can simultaneously support 1.4 billion people and also have multiple megabiodiverse regions. So not only for kites, but also for the conservation of big cats or different majestic animals into our protected area systems. The whole concept of having a convivial coexistence of humans and animals, it has to be attributed to our socio-cultural values or socio-ecological values, which I was discussing in the beginning of this presentation. Of course, now you would like me to spill beans in context of the movement of the birds which are coming from Central Asian steppes and distributing themselves down till Mysuru. So there are records of these birds up till South India, and it would be interesting if people from Kottayam Nature Society help us with the potential movement locations and the timelines of when and where they can see black-eared kites in their backyards. It is important in context of discussion of migratory movements to talk about eBird data. So eBird is a website or an app which many of the bird watchers use. On our screen, we have the distribution of the reports done by amateurs and professionals alike. And when you get to appreciate the data on black-eared kites for June and July from 1975 to 2019 onwards, you can find that most of them are distributed in the northern latitudes. In the next slide, when we appreciate the data for reportings on black-eared kites for December to February period, and when we keep the sampling period as 75 to 2019 itself, you can see that most of these birds are distributed in the southern latitudes. And this was something which has been reported in literature for over 150 years. So people have noticed black-eared kites into Indian subcontinent, and many of the British officers in colonial times have reported them, but nobody actually expected about 95% of birds on Delhi's landfills to to be constituted by the migratory race. It was our effort in 2014 of putting a platform terminal transmitter on the back of one of these birds, like how it is depicted on this slide. And once released, this bird provinces of Russia after having crossed about 4,000 kilometers. This is how the bird we typically trap black kites using mist nets or bal chati nets. And this is how we place these using harnesses much when you're moving out home. On our screen now, we have the pre-post breeding migratory routes depicted in blue and red color respectively. And we have depicted the native movement. 19 the birds which are so localized in India during the wintering time is in association with how infrequently they find foraging resources into their native systems. Of course, a lot of these birds were from a lot of these birds were juveniles, and it was important for us to put transmitters on juveniles to understand how the characteristics which determine the movement of these birds along the migratory route and within the wintering and native systems were dependent on innate qualities. Innate qualities or innate drivers are the ones which are determined by the genetic constitution of the bird itself. And then, because these birds are known to live for about 30 years, they learn a lot from their movements in between the native system and the wintering system. It will be important for us to appreciate down the line that how urban foraging allows birds to funnel themselves into a city system like Delhi and NCR region. So you see about 19 birds from such large region actually get converged on a landfill in Delhi. So this funneling down of distribution of these birds in context of their native systems and the local systems is a sense of worry in context of how human signatures in terms of creation of landfills, in terms of creation of amount of waste, might actually be impacting the bird relationships with other potential species and of course with humans. We are already reeling under the pressure of one such zoonotic disease which has emerged from a human association with a potential consumption of meat or bushmeat. Subsequently, on this slide, I have overlaid the Silk Route which is 5,000 years old. And on this position, we have the city called Urumqi. On this position, we have a city called Bhutan in the valley of Bhutan River itself. It was interesting for us to appreciate that when these birds cross Himalayas at about 6,500 meters, yes, 6,500 meters, because at this height, Himalayas would have temperature of about minus 20 degrees Celsius. These birds, after alighting from the heights of Himalayas, congregated in Bhutan River Valley, and once they were returning from their native systems, they used to congregate in Urumqi. I'm not sure about the proximate impacts of how these cities look, but considering the fact that these cities have been on a trade which has probably been intact for about 5,000 years and which has more cities along this route, there is a lot to appreciate about the movement of kites and where and how they congregate. Not simply in context of ecological perspective, but in context of why it can also be a situation of worry when we are relating human systems with animal systems, or we are forcing animal systems to respond to human dominated system. So the data on this screen is a summary of breeding and wintering migratory journeys. And departure from Indian subcontinent happens in by the end of February every year, and it continues up till late April and early May. early May. The journey takes about 3 weeks when the birds cover about 4,000 kilometers. The speed is about 250 kilometers per day, as opposed to the movement northwards when the birds are actually doing their movements after the summers when the winters are arriving from Central Asian steppes. They start somewhere around mid of August, and this journey continues. Like different individuals start from their own systems, and you would appreciate that the multiple populations would have their own circadian rhythms in context of when they should be starting from their area, and it would be dependent on the daylight hours. So these birds used to start are known to start by the mid of August, and they take about 4 weeks to reach the landfill systems in Delhi. And of course, by the same time, you will have so many different populations distributed down till south. So these days, in context of the lockdown, we are talking about the movement of people from the areas where they have settled in, the mega cities like Delhi, Mumbai, and likewise. And these people are moving from their workplaces to native systems. They take breaks and they stop at multiple places to recharge and refuel in context of the migratory journeys which are done by multiple different species. And when birds take these aerial routes to cover similar distances, they make a lot of stopovers. Isn't it fascinating for us as researchers and as bird watchers and as curious human beings to appreciate the fact that the sites where these birds have stopped for generations after generations are so fixed in context of the learned behavior of these birds. The juveniles follow the adults. The juveniles have their own way to negotiate the path from the native area to the migratory area. And the birds which survive after year after year have learned from how successful they were in the previous seasons. So the birds which do not learn through the course of migratory journeys are likely to be obliterated from the population. And this is how lineages are established in context of which populations tend to survive. We can relate with the loss of Siberian crane population from Bharatpur National Park, wherein the bird numbers were plundered in the areas of stopovers, and those birds are nowhere to be seen these days. So there has been very poor research in this part of the world in context of how human impacts might be altering the stopover sites for these birds when they are making these journeys from their native systems through the wintering systems. Of course, when I was discussing the contribution of human ritual food or human garbage for like black kite, and similarly for different species which take advantage of human food, it is important for us to appreciate that bioaccumulation and biomagnification have marred multiple populations of birds and different animal species. We all know the kind of devastation DDT has brought on multiple species of birds, including the national emblem of United States of America. So DDT, because its biomagnification and bioaccumulation causes thinning of eggshells, has is known to create devastating impacts on pelicans, robins, great the bald eagles in United States, and likewise. We have currently collected samples, blood samples, and made histopathological slides to understand the phenomena in context of urban foraging. Urban foraging, while it creates a lot of opportunities for these birds, needs to be identified in context of what might be the potential impacts of a very urbanized lifestyle in context of what these birds might be suffering through consumption of food resources which are garbage. Another fact which is quite important in relation to COVID-19 times is the microbiome. Because we have a lot of people in this webinar who our medical professionals, they would appreciate the fact of microbiome or the biodiversity of microbes in our guts. So when we suffer with dysentery, amoebic dysentery, or food poisoning, it is the microbiome in our gut which gets affected. And then we are prescribed certain drugs first, which impact the unnecessary bacteria. And of course, you consume antibiotics to kill them. And then we are also given capsules which have spores of the friendly bacteria, which should actually be capitalizing the spaces in our colon. So, in context of the urban foraging, once we are funneling birds from a very large area, birds like kites, birds like different uh, waterfowl, like different species of ducks and other water birds, when they are funneled into these dominated areas, the idea and the situations of worry like COVID-19. So the COVID-19 lockdown has given us alarms in context of conducting research which should actually tackle these questions to avoid similar occurrences of diseases across different localities. Takes inspiration from the study conducted by Zhu and colleagues, and it was published in 2016 in the journal Scientific Reports. So this is in different color light identified in context of the bird movements, and the bird movements are actually in context of the direction of winds and how different from A to point B into systems. So on this screen, you can appreciate different clades or genetic lines of bird flu virus, and it has been depicted in context of the poultry density. The poultry density or production of poultry is being depicted in gray out here, or in gray or shades of gray to black. And it is important to discuss it in context of southern parts of China and South Asia. So these are the two regions which would contribute to about 98% of growth in poultry production. And with poultry, we mean birds like chickens and ducks, which are primarily which are a primary source of incomes for a lot of poor people throughout India. So they bring a lot of economic dividends. But then these birds are also associated with birds like kites, because if we overlay the movement of kites from their native regions to the Indian system, and another towards questions, I might also answer the movement of kites from the eastern part of Mongolia, and when they enter India from the Arunachal Pradesh portion of Himalayas. So once you have relationships of multiple populations of birds moving into the Indian subcontinent through different routes, once you have poultry in the backyard, which might be associated with the food chain because kites are known to be notorious chicken thieves, and from north to south, people somehow, the ones who are keeping poultry in the backyard can relate with the devastating impacts of black kites on their backyard poultry. So, taking inspiration from the atrocities on human lives and non-human lives brought about by COVID-19, it is important for us to understand that something which is so trivial and something which is so regular in our backyard have impacts on human the whole health and of course ecosystem health. And considering the fact that we need to push about 400 million Indians from villages to cities in order to sustain our economies or the rise in the per capita income or to sustain the growth in GDP. So urbanization or movement of people from rural system to urban system or transformation of predominantly rural systems to a relatively urbanized system is inevitable. And India in that context is going to contribute largest number of human beings to its cities. It's good to compare India with China, considering the recent scenario of conflicts. And in that comparison, it is slightly troublesome for us to understand that we have only 75 cities which are potentially the centers of major movements of people from villages to urban sites. In that comparison, China has about 475 cities to take or to absorb the people from their village systems to the urbanized systems. And when Indian cities are crippling under the load of immigration, we are crippling in context of how our socio-cultural expressions are changing to each other, how fast our cultures are evolving, how fast our expressions to animals are evolving due to the urban pressures. In my opinion, the future looks quite grim, and it is important for nature societies like Kotem Nature Society to appreciate the local values apart from taking inspiration from how people appreciate birds and different species. We also need to add to bird watching the idea of how birds can be related to cultures and how young participants into the field activities your society plans and kind of motivate those youth to appreciate the local cultures, specifically in relation to biodiversity. Because people who are youngsters today would ideally become practitioners, would ideally become policymakers, or would also sit on the highest administrative positions in this country. And if they have these local values of appreciating cultural expressions associated with birds and other animal species, maybe we will have situations where we are relatively wiser while taking a tough decision in context of development versus biodiversity sustenance. With these words, it is important for me to acknowledge the contribution of a lot of team members we have, specifically the people who voluntarily associate with us and the people who are our field assistants. They are the backbone of this team, and I would like to acknowledge the contribution of multiple people in this small study, which started as my master's dissertation and has further grown big in context of about 10 people which support this research currently. It is very pleasing to share with you the funding support we have had from Raptor Research and Conservation Foundation Mumbai, who are our main funders and who have funded the basic research as well as the major research, which takes into account the migratory movements of kites in between Central Asia and Delhi. So this is how typically we conduct research into the Delhi system. And we are quite happy with our efforts to inform people about why they need to appreciate the local biodiversity around, not necessarily with kites, but potentially multiple questions in context of snakes, bats, different other species of animals. And we have reached more than 50,000 onlookers. So that establishes the fact that we love questions, and I would be happy to address any questions which audience might have. Thanks a lot.
Hi, this is Patrick from
Hi,
Madurai.
Patrick. Yeah.
What is the impact of, since these black kites are chiefly feeding from the garbage dump,
Hmm.
what is the impact of plastics and other such dangerous objects on the black kites? Uh, is anything known about that?
Um, Idea is that black kites or birds like black kites, which don't actually sit on the garbage quite often and eat, they are not primarily associated with the animal systems which consume plastic. So the problem of plastic consumption is largely attributed to mammalian kind of foraging, where mammals take a lot of munch on a lot of plastic bags which potentially contain edible items. So birds, on the other hand, because they can use their talons or their feet to tear apart and pick what specifically they might like to eat, ideally do not suffer with plastic contamination in their digestive systems. Another aspect is slightly simpler digestive system of uh, birds or kites in context of how the how complex the digestive system is known to happen in context of sorry. So all ungulates have very complex digestive systems and complex stomachs, and birds do not have that complex stomach. And birds like kites, when they are not able to digest certain item, regurgitate in the form of a pellet. So in this context, I would not expect a lot of impact of plastic on in terms of its consumptive effect, but plastic is very readily utilized as a nest decorating material by kites. So you can find a lot of plastic in their nest, and it is quite an opportunistic activity for these kites. Thank you.
Excuse me.
Kites are definitely potential cannibals on each other's nesting systems, and we have recorded twice in the last 8 seasons wherein kites from another nesting territory have removed chicks from a nesting territory of a neighbor and have partly consumed the carcass. But considering that we have a lot of food for these kites available from the human dominated system, either coming from garbage or also coming from the ritual activity which is practiced by Muslims in Delhi, you don't find it very frequent. But you definitely find a lot of tension in between nesting neighbors or potential non breeders in the population who would like to establish a territory. So, in that context, there is a lot of struggle which happens. We don't find a lot of interaction in context of consumptive impacts of lineatus birds on the local breeding birds. So I'm not sure about all parts of India, but from a very limited data which we get to sample or limited birds which we get to observe in Delhi, we have not observed lineatus kites consuming stuff from the nests of Govindas.
I think some network problem with Nishan. Yes. Kumar sir, are you in the meeting? Kumar sir. Shivkumar sir has done a, I think he has done a work on brackets in and around Kannur. So that is why he has put a question there. If he is there live, he can tell something to us.
So the keyword is black kite. Thank you.
Yes, I think he has gone out of network. I'll try to call him by telephone.
So the keyword should be in capital letters or small letters. Okay.
താഴെ പോകുമ്പോ ഇനി എടുക്കുന്നേ ആ ലാൻഡ് ഫോണിന്റെ
Am I audible now? Sorry. Yes, sorry. Sorry for the glitch. Can people ask questions now? Okay. Okay. Yeah. Okay. So the idea of any indicator species is to have a very quick impact. So in context of how kites take opportunity from human dominated systems, we have not noticed very different behaviors of kites in very polluted systems. And by that virtue, kites on landfills are associated with a lot of fumes, burning fumes, and a lot of created a lot of burning areas, and that does not seem to dissuade. So for instance, we use many lichen species which react to the amount of sulfur in air, and that allows us to use them as indicator species. So of course, air pollution and similar kind of pollutants would be impacting kites, humans, and multiple different subspecies. But to use them as indicator, sorry, no.
Nishan,
I could
I
read on the chat. Yeah, sir.
you please put off your camera so that your that band will be used for the sounds.
Okay, so is it better?
Yes.
Okay, sure. So it is very tough for us to talk about the impact of corona just as of now. But thankfully, we have about 30 trail cameras stationed on the nests in different urban pockets. And that means we would be able to get data in context of how well these birds were feeding their chicks when the lockdown was not imposed. And of course, we also have data from for about 50, 60 days for those times when lockdown was imposed. Imposition of lockdown would have a very predictable effect on the potential amount of food which was available to these birds for the ritual meat toxin activity. And of course, there is also expected decline in the amount of garbage or edible garbage which was available for these birds. So currently that data is still not analyzed, but otherwise, in terms of numbers, we did not appreciate a lot of change because black kites are opportunistic predators and scavengers. So the moment they do not have a diet to scavenge upon, they will quickly switch it on to very predictable prey into an urban system, which are pigeons and rats and similar species. Okay, sir. This question would relate in context of the study design we have. Reproductive success, which should vary from one sampling systems are associated with so many drivers which could potentially impact kites. We are still not very sure about how it specifically impacts the reproductive success. When we try to relate it in context of why certain pocket is driving a certain amount of reproductive success, we largely failed.